These days, the extreme confrontation between China and Japan continues. China threatened to behead the Japanese prime minister and made further strong statements about burning him to death. A Chinese official summoned the Japanese ambassador. Right now, there is an extremely intense confrontation going on. Today, let's take a look at the diplomatic battle between China and Japan. Let's get right into it. I covered this in a previous video as well. Prime Minister Takaichi, on November 7th in the House of Representatives, became the first sitting Japanese prime minister to state that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan could be considered a situation threatening Japan's survival, which would allow the exercise of collective self-defense. He also mentioned the possibility of military intervention. The conflict between China and Japan is worsening daily. A Chinese diplomat said the Japanese prime minister should be beheaded, prompting a strong response from Japan and escalating the diplomatic conflict. But what's interesting about this is, on November 14th, China's foreign ministry summoned Japanese ambassador Kenji Kanasugi after Vice Minister Sun Weidong called him in the day before. At that time, they expressed strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition to Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks and lodged a stern protest. In this process, China made it clear to the Japanese side that the Taiwan issue is the core of China's core interests and is an untouchable red line. You especially need to pay close attention to the timing of this summons. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the Japanese ambassador at 2:56 a.m., and as if to boast about this summons, they even distributed a press release emphasizing that the summons took place at such an unusual hour. China has been continuously raising the level of its criticism against Japan. Lin Jin, the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said this: "The Japanese side, even after China made stern negotiations and strong protests, still failed to recognize its mistake and refused to retract its statements. They said that Japan should not play with fire regarding the Taiwan issue, and that those who play with fire will eventually get burned themselves." The Chinese Ministry of Defense also launched a strong attack. The Chinese Ministry of Defense warned that if Japan does not learn from history and intervenes militarily in the Taiwan Strait, it will face the Chinese military's resolve, suffer defeat, and pay a heavy price. In fact, Korea was watching this as if eating popcorn, but suddenly it seems like sparks are flying toward Korea as well. Dai Bing, China's ambassador to South Korea, cautioned that talks between South Korea and the United States on nuclear submarines should be approached cautiously. At a press conference at the Chinese embassy in South Korea, Ambassador Dai Bing called the Korean Peninsula situation complex and urged careful discussion of nuclear submarines. Ambassador Dai Bing said China would have serious concerns if United States forces Korea become involved in a Taiwan contingency. He directly warned South Korea, expressing hope they never ignite the Taiwan issue. Ambassador Dai Bing also voiced strong dissatisfaction about the anti-China protests in Korea. He said China hasn't harmed South Korea and called for an end to Korea's anti-China protests. He also hinted that China is closely watching the movements of the South Korean political circles. Recently, China imposed measures on Japan that amount to a de facto travel ban. While it appears to be a simple travel advisory, given China's diplomatic approach, it's more of a political statement than a mere warning. The Chinese government rarely directly restricts citizens from traveling abroad. Taking these measures clearly shows a strong intent to no longer consider Japan safe. On Sunday, November 15 thus, the Chinese embassy issued an unusual notice on its official WeChat account. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Embassy warned travelers to use extreme caution when visiting Japan soon. If you look at the notice, it becomes clear that it's not just a simple travel advisory, but a message based on a significant sense of crisis. It even includes instructions for Chinese nationals already staying in Japan to closely monitor the local security situation and to pay special attention to their personal safety when going out. What we need to pay attention to is the justification that China presented for taking this measure. China claimed that the recent Japanese leadership has made public statements about the Taiwan issue that are conscious of China, and that this has greatly worsened the environment for people-to-people exchanges between China and Japan. In particular, Japan used the expression that the possibility of Chinese people living or staying there facing physical threats has increased. This reflects China's view that anti-China sentiment is rising in Japan, but there's another key point. When China takes measures that go as far as advising its citizens to refrain from visiting certain countries, there is always a diplomatic message included. This measure is also being interpreted as a means of political pressure on the Japanese government. A warning not to cross the line any further on the Taiwan issue has been disguised as a measure to protect its own citizens. Chinese state-run media widely reported the advisory against visiting Japan, stressing Japan's responsibility. On Chinese social media, claims that Japan is now unsafe are also spreading. In addition, there is analysis within China that this measure may not just be a short-term advisory, but could create structural tensions throughout the overall diplomatic relationship between China and Japan. When China tightens travel advisories for a country, economic, cultural, and tourism exchanges with that country quickly decline. China's travel restrictions have often signaled deteriorating relations between the two countries. Some say this resembles China's actions against Korea during the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Incident. Given these points, this travel restriction is more than a warning. It's strong diplomatic pressure from China toward Japan. The Japanese government is directly addressing China's offensive. Karama Noru, the chief cabinet secretary, emphasized at a press conference on the 11th that Japan's consistent position is that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait are important not only for Japan, but for the entire international community. He also stated that these explanations and Japan's stance have been fully conveyed to the Chinese side. In fact, one of the reasons the conflict between China and Japan has escalated so much is because of the harsh remarks made by Shijan, the Chinese consul general in Osaka. Shijan, the consul general in Osaka, stirred controversy by posting on social media that the dirty neck that jumps in recklessly can only be cut off instantly without hesitation. He made a statement about beheading Prime Minister Takachi. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the chief cabinet secretary strongly protested to China, calling the expression extremely inappropriate and unacceptable for a diplomat. Some in Japan are already calling for Consul General Shilyan's expulsion. Anti-China sentiment is rising in Japan, especially after Prime Minister Takachi's remarks, which changed the national mood. Japanese society has often seen the Taiwan issue as a foreign regional conflict. However, these recent remarks are completely changing the atmosphere. In Japan, many now see this issue as a direct threat to national stability, not just an external problem. Japan's major broadcasters are reflecting this trend as well. Japan's main broadcasters report rising Taiwan Strait tensions, emphasizing Japan can't stay uninvolved if conflict arises. Economic and general newspapers are even more explicit. Yomiuri Shimbun and Nihon Keizai Shimbun warn of economic and military shocks Japan could face if conflict erupts in Taiwan. The political climate is turbulent, with some in the ruling party saying Prime Minister Takatsu's comments are too blunt. Senior lawmakers worry about possible Chinese retaliation and suggest softening remarks. Despite concerns, overall sentiment is shifting toward Prime Minister Takatsu. Japanese public opinion is clearly backing his actions. Opinion polls in Japan show strong approval for Prime Minister Takatsu. Additionally, rising anti-China sentiment in Japan is boosting Prime Minister Takatsu's public support. A significant number of Japanese people believe that as China's military pressure intensifies, Japan should not back down. So even if some in the political circles urge Takatsu to be more cautious, in the end, it's public opinion that determines the direction, which means his statements and policy direction are gaining more and more momentum. The Takatsu-led hardliners are now issuing even bolder messages, supported by the public. This trend parallels rising Taiwan Strait tensions, indicating growing fear and determination in Japan. Japan has now moved beyond the stage of diplomatic debate and entered a phase where the entire security paradigm is being shaken. It can be said that Japan itself, as a major power, is beginning to reorganize internally as it accepts a new era of reality. Current trends suggest the strong China-Japan confrontation is unlikely to soon escalate into full-scale military conflict. With both countries among Asia's top military and economic powers, direct conflict would cause irreversible losses for both. In particular, if China were to start a full-scale war, it would face the burden of confronting the entire alliance structure of the United States and Japan. Likewise, if Japan escalates to a military response, its economy and overall security would suffer a massive shock. However, easing tensions is unlikely. In fact, China-Japan relations may become even more volatile. The China Coast Guard may deploy near the Senkaku Islands and provoke Japan. China may be signaling increased military pressure in the East China Sea as Japan becomes more involved in the Taiwan issue. It's the same for Japan. The self-defense forces are strengthening their intelligence and surveillance activities, and the frequency of air self-defense force fighter jet sorties is also increasing. It is highly likely that the situation where both countries' military and Coast Guard forces monitor each other in the same waters will become much more routine in the future. The intensity of the conflict is also expected to increase. China has made it clear that the Taiwan issue is its core interest among core interests, and Japan has begun to share with its people the perception that peace and stability in Taiwan are directly linked to its own security. In this situation, a structure is being created in which it is difficult for both countries to back down. When Japan officially raised the possibility of intervening in a Taiwan contingency, the conflict shifted from a brief diplomatic dispute to a structural confrontation. Given this trend, Japan is likely to pursue a major military buildup. Japan is boosting defense spending and quickly expanding its missile and defense systems. Polls indicate growing support for strengthening Japan's military power. As tensions with China grow, Japan will likely strengthen alliances and boost self-defense forces' combat abilities. China is likely to keep pressuring Japan, claiming its military buildup will escalate the Northeast Asia arms race. Especially if Japan aligns itself more closely with the United States on the Taiwan issue, China's diplomatic backlash could become even stronger than it is now. In the end, even if the relationship between China and Japan does not escalate into war, it is highly likely to continue in the form of diplomatic and military standoffs centered on the Senkaku Islands, entrenched mutual criticism, expanding conflicts in maritime security, intensified public opinion battles, and repeated diplomatic clashes. In short, the relationship between China and Japan is likely to remain highly tense in the future, potentially shaking the overall security environment of East Asia. What do you think about the extreme standoff between China and Japan? Please share your thoughts in the comments. That's all for this video, thank you.